Gideon Nash no longer believes anything good can come from a broken heart. 2 years ago, he had been a different man, a husband who sat by his wife's side through hours of labor, holding her hand as the doctors shook their heads in frustration, then fell silent as the baby's cries never came. They said time would heal. But for Gideon, time had only turned the pain to stone, as cold and solid as the walls he had built around himself. In the barren land by the river, where no one visited and no one cared enough to ask, Gideon chose to live like a ghost in the body of a living person. He built his life with iron discipline, waking up early in the morning, checking the fence, taking care of the animals, not talking, not interacting, and absolutely not letting anyone near his heart. Emotions to him were a locked door, and the key he buried with his wife and children on that tragic rainy afternoon. But fate, which cares nothing for the walls men try to build, chose one morning after a great storm to knock on Gideon's door with an unforgettable image. The river was high from the heavy rains of the night before. The currents were murky and muddy, as if nature itself were angry. Gideon rode along the bank, inspecting the washed-out fence, his heart as cold as the wet weather. And then he saw her, a small body lying sprawled on the cold mud, hair disheveled, dress torn, body purple, and motionless. But it wasn't her who made his footsteps stop abruptly. But it was the baby, wrapped tightly in a muddy white blanket, held in her arms so tight that even though he was unconscious, even though blood was flowing from his forehead, her arms were still like a barrier protecting the baby from this cruel world. Gideon's heart, Nung thought, dead clenched. It was as if time had suddenly snapped and transported him back to the birthing room, where Sarah had struggled with pain, where he had heard his son's heart stop before he could live. His breath caught, his hand shook. "Don't be stupid," Gideon reason whispered. "Just walk away like you always do. No one needs your saving." But instinct is stronger than reason, especially the instinct of a man who had helplessly watched the person he loved disappear and had lived every day since then in torment with the what-if feeling. He dismounted. His boots sank deep into the mud, and the icy water seeped through his coat. But all he saw was her, the young woman who had fought with all her might to keep the baby alive, and the baby gasping, trembling but alive. "Girl," he said, his voice hoarse from not speaking to anyone but his horse for so long. There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the trickling of water. Gideon bent down, his hand on her neck. Her heart was still beating weakly. He looked at the baby, probably only a few months old, nestled against the woman's chest as if it were the only place in the world where it could exist. Something inside him broke, the smallest iceberg in the vast iceberg. But just one crack was enough. He held them both gently, as if picking up something precious that he thought would never belong to him. The baby snuggled into his chest, clinging to his shirt with its tiny fingers. And though he didn't understand why in that moment, it felt right, just like the silence that eased in his mind. Just like an unhealed wound suddenly felt warm. Just like the faint light at the end of the tunnel for someone who was too used to living in the darkness. Gideon Nash didn't believe in miracles. But as he rode back to the cabin holding those two little lives in his arms, a feeling rose in his heart. He thought he had forgotten hope. Gideon's cabin had been a lonely fortress where the only sounds were the wind whistling through the cracks in the door and the flickering firelight reflecting on the stone walls. But that morning in the familiar cold room, there was the soft breathing of a child, the faint moans from the bed he had never let anyone else sleep in, and those sounds made his heart beat differently. The woman, was still unconscious, her pale face standing out against the old pillow. The wound on her forehead needed cleaning. Gideon lit the fire, boiled water, and for the first time in years, his hands were rough with emotion, not work. As he carefully wiped the wound on her forehead, Willa stirred. Her green eyes fluttered open, clouded with fatigue and fear, but immediately her gaze darted to the child. "Baby." Her voice was rough like sandpaper through pain. "He's okay, right here with you," Gideon said, surprised at the tenderness in his own voice. The girl trembled as she examined the baby, each finger, each breath. When she was sure it was alive, she let out a breath, a soft, broken sigh. "Are you its mother?" She looked up. There was something deeper in her eyes than pain, the memory of a choice. "No, but it was mine. Mine now." Her voice needed no explanation. It was an oath, a promise to the dead or to herself. The baby began to cry. The sound was thin as silk, but it was like a knife to Gideon's heart, awakening something he had long suppressed. He flinched. Willa tried to sit up, gritting her teeth in pain. I, I'll hold her. You shouldn't move. Without thinking, Gideon stepped forward, lifting the baby and shaking hands. She stopped crying as soon as he held her cheek pressed against his chest, her tiny hands clutching at the hem of his shirt, as if clinging to life. The feeling, the soft warmth, the absolute trust took Gideon's breath away. His body stiffened, as if he were holding the son he would never get to hold. No one had taught him how to be a father. No one had taught him how to let his heart break and heal. But in that moment, he knew the Father's love has no blood. It begins with staying when every reason tells you to leave. Willa watched him, her eyes no longer those of fear, but of someone seeing for the first time. Faith. His name is Tommy. Gideon nodded, not taking his eyes off the baby nestled against his chest as if it were home. Where are you going west? California, maybe. Where they don't ask questions. She said it like it was a distant dream, like she didn't believe she could get there. Gideon didn't answer right away. He set Tommy down beside her and covered her with the blanket. In his mind, the rain outside had stopped, but in the cabin, another sound was just beginning, the sound of life. Willa, shivering with hunger and cold, was given a simple bowl of soup. She ate each spoonful like someone who had just come out of the desert, not just for the food, but for the feeling of being cared for. Gideon looked at her as if he were a stranger digging into the dead soil inside him, planting a small seed, a fragile but real trust. That day, the cabin was no longer a prison. It was the beginning of something new. The next morning, the cabin was strangely quiet. There was no rain, only a thin mist hovering over the waterlogged fields. But even in the silence, Gideon sensed something had changed, as if the air carried the scent of approaching danger. Willa slept restlessly, her dreams making her cringe whenever Tommy stirred in her arms. When Gideon gently placed his hand on her shoulder to wake her, the first look she gave him was not gratitude or relief. It was fear. "Do you hear anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. Gideon was silent. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, many of them approaching. He walked quickly to the window and parted the frayed curtain. 4 men on horseback were approaching the cabin. They wore long coats and sat still like trained gunmen. The morning light glinted off the butts of the rifles at their hips. Gideon didn't need to ask. He knew who they were. Marcus's gang, Willa whispered, pale. He found me. How Marcus has people everywhere. Henchmen, trackers, sometimes even so-called sheriffs. He paid a high price to find you. And Tommy. Gideon tightened his grip on his gun. The feeling in his chest was no longer fear, but cold anger. They wanted more than the baby. They wanted to erase anyone who had ever witnessed Marcus's secret, his selling of babies as commodities. Willa took his hand, her eyes pleading. You still have a chance. They just want me. Let me out. I will, no, Gideon said firmly. You and the baby are under my roof, and that means they belong to me. No one touches my family. There was a heavy knocking on the door. A deep voice said, Nash, we know she's in there. Don't turn something as simple as this into bloodshed. Gideon stepped back, his eyes fixed on the door. This has never been simple, he whispered. He turned to Willa. If anything bad happens, you and the baby run out the back door. I'll hold them. No! She jumped up, though the pain from her unhealed ribs kept her down. They will kill you if I let them take you to. I would have died long ago. A gunshot rang out, shattering the front window. Willa screamed, clutching Tommy to her chest. Gideon lunged forward and flipped over a large wooden table, creating a makeshift barricade. The Colt 45 in his hand was more than just a weapon. It was a declaration of war from a man determined not to let the past repeat itself. Outside, footsteps approached. A bullet slammed into the back door, splintering the wood. Hand her over, one of them shouted. She's not worth dying for. Then you'll have to see how much I'm worth, Gideon growled, shooting back. The shot rang out like thunder in a clear sky. One man fell from his horse. The other 2 scattered. Marcus did not appear. He waited. He always waited until his prey was desperate. Tommy began to cry. Willa, shaking, looked around. What can I do? What should I do? Gideon reloaded, keeping his eyes on the door. Get the Winchester from the mantelpiece. Sarah used it. Can you shoot? Willa nodded. My dad taught me since I was little. Then you don't just survive. You fight. When Marcus finally appeared, huge, scarred from ear to chin, he smiled as if it had all been over. Gideon Nash, he said, his voice smooth and menacing, want to save her so badly that you'll kill yourself. Gideon rose from his hiding place, facing him from behind the broken doorframe. No, but if I must die, at least I die for something worth dying for. Then he made a proposal one-on-one. The one who lives wins all. The one who loses stays on the ground. Marcus sneered. Alone, are you stupid or are you crazy brave? I don't fight alone, Gideon replied. Gunfire erupted. Marcus turned just as Willa's Winchester bullet struck his shoulder. Another fell. Gideon fired the final shot. It hit Marcus in the chest, sending him sprawling to the cold, wet ground. The other two looked at each other, then turned and ran. Gideon didn't chase. He just knelt, panting, blood dripping from his shoulder, but his eyes were still searching for the only thing that mattered, Willa and Tommy. Willa stood there, gun in hand, tears in her eyes, but determined. Gideon smiled, blood seeping through his shirt. My family is safe. The smoke had cleared. The ground in front of the cabin was stained with blood, but inside the old wooden house the air carried something else, peace. Not the temporary peace between battles, but the kind that comes when one decides to stay rather than run. Gideon sat on the floor, bandaged to his left shoulder, mouth pressed tightly together to keep from moaning. Willa, her hands still shaking from her first fatal shot, carefully wiped away his blood. Tommy lay fast asleep on the bed, completely unaware that he had just escaped the clutches of a demon. She said nothing for several minutes. Gideon, on the other hand, watched silently. He saw her face strong and broken at the same time, and he knew that in the battle, the one thing Willa had fought for more than her life was silence. Willa, he said, his voice low and deep. I know you're still hiding something. She paused, then looked up. No evasion, no beating around the bush. I lied about Tommy's mother. Gideon nodded as if he had known it all along. But he let her continue, for there were truths that needed to be told, not to judge, but to free. She didn't die of a difficult birth, Willa whispered. She was killed by Marcus, because she knew too much. She sat down next to Gideon, her eyes looking out the window, where the afternoon light was filtering through the leaves. I was one of the girls Marcus kept, against her will. She, Tommy's mother, was the only one who dared to dream of escaping, to speak up. When she said she would report him, Marcus strangled her with his bare hands, then told everyone she died in childbirth. Her voice choked. I couldn't save her, but I couldn't let him touch Tommy. So I took him and ran out into the rain with nothing but a fragile hope that somewhere there would be someone better than Marcus. Gideon looked at her a long time. And you found it. There was a long silence. Then Willa let out a breath, a sigh that seemed to fall from the depths of her soul. Don't you see that I'm trash? No, he said without thinking. I see someone who chose to love a child who was not their own. Someone who risked her freedom to save a life. You are not broken, Willa. You are broken. And you are still standing. She turned to him. For the first time, her eyes weren't defensive. They were longing. And can you love someone like me? With all that history? Gideon reached out and took her thin hand. Willa, I loved someone so much, and then I lost her. He swallowed back the pain of the memory. I thought my heart had died with Sarah. But then you appeared. Not as an angel, but as broken as I was. You don't need saving, Willa. You just need someone brave enough to stay. And I will stay, if you want me to. Willa said nothing, just rested her forehead on his shoulder, her hand tightening. I want to. She whispered it as if it were the greatest truth in her life. Tommy turned in his sleep, letting out a small groan. Both adults looked toward him, and in that moment, they were no longer two people running, but three people making a start. No past is forgotten, but no longer a chain. For the first time in years, Gideon Nash dares to dream, not of what is lost, but of a tomorrow where he is not alone. 3 days after the duel, Gideon buried Marcus Vane and his men behind the cabin, where the ground was hard and the wind never stopped. Not out of respect for them, but because he believed that hatred should not be left on the land where one lived. Willa stood beside him, holding Tommy in her arms, as if the child's life were the final answer to the darkness of death. Gideon said nothing, but something in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the coldness that hid his pain. It was the certainty of a man who had chosen love again, knowing the risks it carried. That afternoon, a figure on horseback appeared on the trail in front of the cabin. The young girl, her hair tousled by the wind, jumped from the saddle and ran toward the porch. Willa almost dropped Tommy when she saw the familiar face, Lucy. The two sisters hugged each other in choked sobs, their words mixed with panic and joy. Lucy brought bad news. Marcus had not acted alone. He had offered a reward for anyone who could find Willow and the baby. In Denver, where Lucy was hiding, word had spread to the liquor store, the train station, even the police station. "We're running out of time," Lucy said. "Marcus is dead, but the money he left behind lives on." Gideon heard all of this without flinching. He had been prepared for this. "We are not staying here." He spoke calmly, like someone who had decided to leave suffering behind and knew what was worth taking with him. "Where do you have in mind?" Willa asked. "Oregon," said Lucy. "We have an aunt there, Clara. She keeps a boarding house in a frontier town, a place where the police don't care about questions, only kindness. If there was any place in the world to start over, it's that place." Gideon nodded, and just one day later they set off. A small carriage, an old horse, a baby, a woman with an old wound, a young girl who had lived in fear, and a man who thought he had nothing left to lose. Family doesn't always start with blood. Sometimes it starts with choice. Gideon chose Willa when he saw her by the river. Willa chose Tommy unasked. Lucy chose her sister despite the danger. And now, together, they chose a future. On the long journey west, they passed through the wilderness, passing through small towns that were strange for a morning and forgotten by evening. Tommy slept in Willa's arms, learning to laugh at Gideon's deep voice telling stories. Lucy gradually regained her youthful mischievousness, occasionally teasing Gideon as a stern but infatuated father. On clear nights, they would light a campfire and sit together under the stars. Gideon would listen to Willa sing lullabies, his hand gently holding hers, a hold that required no oath, but was full of promise. Love does not erase what is lost, but it allows one to live on, with a reason. One morning on the Oregon frontier, as the wagon wheels crunched across the thin land, Gideon looked ahead, at the light glinting on the distant mountains. Willa rested her head on his shoulder. Tommy slept. Lucy rode beside him, her face relaxed for the first time in days. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Willa whispered. "No," Gideon replied, his voice hoarse but warm. "I think we'll be better off." She laughed softly, the sound like wind through pine trees. "I never believed in tomorrow." "Neither did I," Gideon said. "Until you came along. Ahead is a new land, a life that no one has written. But behind them are choices strong enough to tear through the darkness, leading them towards the light."